The cold wind howled through the empty streets as Dr. Samuel Carter locked his car and made his way toward the entrance of St. Augustine Hospital. The night shift was always eerie, but something about tonight felt different, like an invisible presence lingering in the air. He pulled his coat tighter around his body and sighed, his breath forming a ghostly mist in the freezing air. As he approached the glass doors, he noticed the dog again. The stray had been there for weeks now, always sitting in the exact same spot near the entrance, its dark, sorrowful eyes fixed on the building. It never begged for food or approached anyone, just sat there, waiting. Samuel had asked the security guards about it, but they only shrugged. "It never causes trouble," one had said. "Just watches." But tonight, something about the dog unsettled him more than usual. Maybe it was the way its matted fur looked damp from the evening frost, or how its ribs protruded through its thin body. Maybe it was the way it never blinked, its gaze almost too human. He shook off the feeling and stepped inside, the automatic doors sliding shut behind him with a soft whoosh. The hospital was quiet, save for the occasional beep of monitors and the distant murmur of nurses speaking in hushed voices. Samuel checked in at the front desk, exchanging a tired nod with the receptionist before heading toward the break room for a cup of coffee. Just as he reached for the pot, a nurse rushed in, her face pale. "Dr. Carter," she whispered urgently. "Something's wrong in room 306. Samuel set his cup down, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Room 306 housed Mr. Abernathy, an elderly man who had been admitted a week ago after suffering a severe stroke. "What happened?" he asked, already moving. The nurse hesitated, wringing her hands. I don't know how to explain it. He was stable an hour ago, but when I checked on him just now, he was speaking." Samuel frowned. "That's good news, isn't it?" The nurse swallowed hard. "Dr. Carter, Mr. Abernathy hasn't spoken in over 5 years." A chill ran down Samuel's spine, but he forced himself to stay composed. Patients recovering from strokes sometimes experienced unexpected bursts of speech. It wasn't unheard of. He pushed open the door to room 306. Inside, Mr. Abernathy sat upright in bed, his milky white eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. His lips moved rapidly, forming words too low for Samuel to hear clearly. His fingers trembled against the thin blanket. Samuel stepped closer, his breath catching as he finally made out the words. The dog is watching." A sharp knock at the door made Samuel jump. He turned quickly, finding the same nurse standing in the doorway, her face now deathly pale. "Dr. Carter," she whispered. "The dog, it's inside." Samuel's pulse hammered in his chest as he strode out of the room. He scanned the dimly lit hallway, his eyes darting in every direction. The hospital was secure, there was no way a stray animal could have wandered in. "Where did you see it?" he demanded. The nurse pointed down the corridor. "Near the old wing, by the morgue." Samuel's stomach twisted. The old wing of the hospital had been abandoned for nearly a decade. It had once housed the psychiatric ward, but after a series of incidents, it had been shut down permanently. Few dared to go near it. With a deep breath, he started walking, his footsteps echoing through the empty hall. The air grew colder as he neared the morgue, and the fluorescent lights overhead flickered erratically. Then he saw it. The dog stood just beyond the doors to the morgue, its thin body illuminated by the dull yellow glow of an emergency light. Its eyes, black, endless pits, locked onto his. Samuel's breath hitched. The air around the dog seemed wrong, as if the space it occupied was somehow disconnected from reality. Then, without warning, the dog turned and padded through the morgue doors, disappearing into the darkness beyond. A powerful, inexplicable force compelled Samuel to follow. He pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The room smelled of antiseptic and something deeper, something rotting. The steel tables stood empty, their surfaces gleaming under the dim lights. A row of body lockers lined the far wall, their handles glinting. The dog was nowhere to be seen. But something else caught Samuel's attention. One of the body lockers was open. The heavy door stood ajar, revealing nothing but an inky black void inside. Samuel hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But then he heard it, a faint scratching sound from within the locker. His breath came in short, shallow gasps as he stepped closer. Slowly, he reached out and gripped the edge of the door. The scratching stopped. Silence. Then, a voice, raspy, barely more than a whisper. "You should not have followed." Samuel stumbled back, his heart pounding. The air grew thick, suffocating. Shadows twisted along the walls, stretching toward him like grasping hands. And then, something moved inside the locker. A pale hand, thin, bony, with impossibly long fingers, emerged from the darkness, its nails clicking against the metal surface. The air filled with the stench of decay. Samuel turned and ran, his breath ragged as he burst through the doors and into the hallway. He didn't stop until he reached the nurse's station, where the night staff stared at him in confusion. "The dog," he gasped. "It went into the morgue. There's something in there." The head nurse gave him a bewildered look. "Dr. Carter," she said carefully, "the morgue has been locked all night. No one's been in or out." Samuel shook his head violently. "No, I saw it. The dog." He stopped. The stray dog sat right outside the hospital entrance, exactly where it always did. Waiting. Watching. But this time, it was smiling. Samuel stood frozen, his eyes locked on the stray outside the hospital doors. The dog's unnatural grin sent an icy chill down his spine. It wasn't just a trick of the light. Its lips were curled in a way that no ordinary dog's ever should be. The nurse beside him was still staring at him, concerned. "Dr. Carter, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Maybe he had. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe normally. I'm fine," he lied. "Just tired." The nurse hesitated before nodding slowly. "Maybe you should take a break." Samuel didn't respond. He was still staring at the dog. Then, as if it could hear his thoughts, the dog tilted its head slightly, the way a person might when they recognize someone they've been waiting for. Something was very, very wrong. The next night, Samuel tried to shake off the events of the previous night, convincing himself that exhaustion had made him hallucinate. But as soon as he arrived at the hospital for his shift, he felt it again, that unsettling presence, like unseen eyes watching him. And of course, the dog was there. Sitting. Waiting. Watching. Tonight, however, something was different. There was a new patient, an unconscious woman, admitted after a severe car accident. Her name was Rachel Wells. Samuel glanced at her chart as he did his rounds. She was still in critical condition, unresponsive, with a weak pulse. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. The dog was staring directly into Rachel's room from the glass window outside. A lump formed in Samuel's throat. The dog's eyes were locked onto the unconscious woman, its body unnaturally still. What was it watching? Samuel was in his office, struggling to concentrate on paperwork, when the monitor beeped. Rachel's vitals were spiking. He rushed to her room, expecting to see signs of distress, but instead he found something much worse. Rachel's body was rigid, her eyes wide open, though completely lifeless. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. Then, in a voice that was not her own, she whispered, "The dog knows the dead." Samuel's blood turned to ice. Rachel's body lurched forward violently, as if something inside her was trying to escape. The machines around her went haywire, beeping erratically. Then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. Rachel collapsed back onto the bed. The monitors steadied. She was unconscious again. Samuel staggered backward, gripping the doorframe for support. His mind reeled. That voice, it hadn't sounded like Rachel at all. It was guttural, deep, as if something ancient had spoken through her. Then he heard it. A low, scratching sound. It was coming from the window. Samuel turned slowly. The dog was standing there, but this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, shadowy figures moved in the darkness, distorted, flickering shapes that twisted unnaturally. The dog's grin widened. Samuel felt his stomach drop. Something was very, very wrong with this hospital. A horrifying discovery. Unable to shake the terror in his gut, Samuel needed answers. He stormed toward the security office, desperate to check the hospital's surveillance footage. The guard on duty, an older man named Hank, gave him a confused look. "You all right, Doc? You look like you've seen a ghost." Samuel hesitated. Maybe he had. "I need to see last night's footage from the morgue," he said, keeping his voice steady. Hank scratched his head but shrugged. "Sure thing." He pulled up the footage, fast-forwarding through hours of mundane recordings. Then, at 2:14 a.m., the screen glitched. A dark figure appeared at the edge of the frame. Samuel's stomach twisted as the image flickered. The figure moved jerkily, like a puppet with broken strings. Then suddenly, the stray dog walked into the frame. It approached the shadowy figure, and then something horrific happened. The figure knelt down, and the dog whispered into its ear. Samuel's breath caught. That wasn't possible. Dogs didn't whisper. But the figure nodded, as if it understood. Then the screen went black. The footage ended. Samuel sat in stunned silence. His pulse pounded. The dog wasn't just watching the hospital. It was talking to something inside it. The morgue's forgotten past. Samuel knew there was only one place left to look for answers: the hospital's old records. He made his way to the archival basement, where decades' worth of patient files gathered dust. After nearly an hour of digging through old documents, his fingers stopped on a weathered newspaper clipping. The headline sent a chill through his entire body. "Mysterious fire at Augustine Psychiatric Ward, 7 dead." Samuel's hands trembled as he read further. The fire had happened 10 years ago, in the very wing of the hospital that was now abandoned. The article listed 7 names, patients who had died in the flames. Then, at the very bottom of the article, a single photo caught his eye. A dog. The same stray dog that had been sitting outside the hospital all these weeks. His stomach lurched. That wasn't possible. If this photo was taken 10 years ago, then the dog should be long dead. But it wasn't. It was still here. Still waiting. Still watching. A terrifying realization. Samuel's breath came in quick, panicked bursts. His mind raced with horrifying possibilities. That dog, it wasn't just a stray. It was a harbinger. A messenger of something much darker. It had been here when the fire happened. It had been here when those patients died. And now it was watching again. But, as if in answer, a sound echoed from deep within the basement. A low growl. Samuel spun around, his pulse hammering. In the farthest corner of the room, where the light barely reached, the dog was there. But this time, its eyes were not sorrowful. They were hungry. And then, in a voice that was not human, it spoke. "Doctor, it's your turn now." The lights went out, and the darkness swallowed him whole. The darkness was absolute. Samuel's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he fumbled for his phone, his fingers slick with sweat. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out every rational thought. He pressed the power button. Nothing. The screen remained black. Then he heard it. The breathing. It wasn't his own. A slow, raspy inhalation, like lungs that had forgotten how to work. It came from right behind him. His entire body seized with fear, every instinct screaming at him not to turn around. Then the dog's voice, low, guttural, wrong. "He is awake now." Something touched the back of his neck, cold, skeletal fingers brushing against his skin. Samuel screamed. The escape. He lunged forward, knocking over stacks of old patient files as he scrambled blindly in the darkness. His shoulder slammed into a metal filing cabinet, sending pain shooting through his arm, but he didn't stop. The breathing behind him grew closer. He reached out desperately, his fingers grazing the door handle. With every ounce of strength, he wrenched it open and stumbled into the dimly lit hallway. He turned and slammed the door shut, pressing his weight against it. Silence. His chest heaved as he tried to steady himself. Whatever had been in that room, it wasn't human. The air felt different out here, thicker, heavier, wrong. And then he noticed something even worse. The hallway was no longer the hospital. The place between. The once familiar sterile walls were now charred and crumbling, as if they had been consumed by fire. Ash rained softly from the ceiling like dead snowflakes. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered erratically, casting twisted shadows that moved on their own. Samuel's stomach twisted with nausea. This wasn't reality. This was somewhere else. A soft clicking sound echoed from down the hall. Footsteps. No, not footsteps. Close. Something was walking toward him. Samuel turned, his breath hitching. At the far end of the hallway, emerging from the smoke and darkness, was the dog. But it wasn't alone. Behind it stood 7 figures, their bodies blackened and charred, their faces featureless except for their gaping mouths. Their lips moved but no sound came out. Samuel's knees nearly buckled. These were the patients from the fire. The ones who had died. And they had come back. The truth revealed. The dog stepped forward, tilting its head as it stared at him. Then, in that same inhuman voice, it whispered, "Do you remember, Doctor?" Samuel shook his head, his entire body trembling. Remember what? The air grew even heavier, pressing against his chest like unseen hands. The dog's grin widened. The fire was no accident. Samuel's vision blurred. A sharp pain lanced through his skull, as if something were trying to force its way into his mind. Flashes of memories, ones he didn't recognize, filled his head. A locked ward. Patients screaming. A doctor turning away as the flames began to rise. Samuel gasped, his hands clutching at his head. No, this wasn't right. He had nothing to do with the fire. Did he? The dog took another step forward, its shadow stretching unnaturally across the scorched floor. You left them to die, Samuel. Samuel staggered back, his breathing ragged. That's not true. I wasn't even here when the fire. The words died in his throat. Because suddenly, deep within his mind, he saw something horrifying. A reflection. A man in a doctor's coat. His coat. Standing outside the burning psychiatric ward. Watching. Turning his back. Walking away. His stomach lurched. This wasn't his memory. It couldn't be. But the dog only laughed, a low, rattling sound that did not belong in this world. He remembers now. The air around him shattered like glass. And Samuel fell. The awakening. His eyes flew open. He was back in the hospital, lying on the floor outside the basement archive. His heart thundered in his chest as he scrambled to his feet, his hands shaking violently. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? The hospital seemed normal again, the walls clean, the lights steady. But something was still wrong. He turned toward the entrance. The stray dog was gone. Instead, a man stood in its place. Dressed in an old, tattered patient gown. His skin was burnt and peeling, his face twisted into an unnatural grin. And his eyes were the same pitch-black voids as the dog's. Samuel's breath hitched. He tried to step back, but his legs wouldn't move. The man raised a charred, bony hand and pointed directly at him. Then, in a voice that was now far too familiar, he whispered, "It's your turn now." Samuel's vision flickered. And the world went black. Samuel's world collapsed into darkness. For a terrifying moment, he felt as if he were falling, tumbling through an endless void with no sense of time or space. His breath came in short, panicked gasps, but there was no air, only a crushing emptiness. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the falling stopped. Samuel's body slammed onto a cold, hard surface. Pain shot through his limbs, and he groaned, pushing himself up onto shaky hands. His vision swam as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. The hospital was gone. He was in a long, endless corridor, stretching into the dark. The walls were old and decayed, covered in charred handprints and faded, peeling paint. A dim, flickering light bulb swung from the ceiling, casting elongated shadows that seemed to move on their own. Something about this place felt wrong. Then he heard it. Whispering. It came from the darkness ahead, low, murmuring voices, speaking in a language that wasn't human. The sound slithered through the air, worming its way into his ears, his mind. Samuel shivered. He wasn't alone. The walk of the dead. A sense of dread settled into his bones as he took a cautious step forward. The floor beneath him felt soft, not like wood or concrete, but flesh, as if he were walking on something alive. The whispers grew louder. Samuel clenched his fists. He had no choice but to move forward. Standing still in this place felt dangerous, like something unseen was waiting for him to hesitate. As he walked, Figures began to emerge from the walls. Silent, motionless shadows watching. Their faces were featureless, their bodies thin and twisted, like burnt paper crumbling at the edges. They didn't move, didn't reach for him, just watched. Samuel forced himself to keep walking. But as he passed, he noticed something horrifying. Each figure bore a faint resemblance to someone he had treated. The old man from room 306. The young woman who had died in surgery. The patient who had never woken from his coma. These weren't just shadows. They were the dead. And they were following him. The room of no escape. A door appeared ahead, old, wooden, marked with deep claw marks. A single word was carved into the surface. Confess. Samuel hesitated. His pulse thundered in his ears. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but there was nowhere to go. The whispering voices were closing in, pressing against his skull like unseen hands. With shaking fingers, he reached for the door handle and pushed it open. Inside, the room was small, just 4 walls, a single chair, and a massive mirror spanning the far side. The air was thick with the stench of burnt flesh. Samuel stepped inside, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Then in the mirror, he saw himself. But it wasn't just a reflection. It was him, standing in the burning psychiatric ward 10 years ago. The memory slammed into him like a train. Flames roaring, patients screaming, smoke choking the air. And in the center of it all, himself, standing at the door watching it burn. He had been there. He had let them die. No, Samuel whispered, shaking his head. This isn't real. This isn't me. But his reflection smiled. You remember now. Samuel stumbled backward, his chest tightening. The air in the room shifted, growing heavier. The whispering voices turned into screams. The door behind him slammed shut. Then the dog's voice, calm, patient. Say it, doctor. Samuel's hands trembled. Say what? Say what you did. His reflection stepped forward, but the real Samuel couldn't move. You let them burn, the reflection whispered. You walked away. You left them. Samuel clenched his fists. I didn't. The dog's voice interrupted him. Lies won't save you. The walls of the room began to bleed, dark streaks seeping down like ink. The whispers became shrieks, echoing all around him. The air felt like it was being sucked away, leaving Samuel gasping. He was running out of time. The final choice. Samuel fell to his knees, his hands gripping his head. His mind was breaking apart, memories twisting and unraveling. He couldn't tell what was real anymore. The dog's shadow stretched across the room, its black eyes endless voids. Confess or join them. The shrieking grew unbearable. The shadows in the mirror moved, reaching for him, their charred hands inches from his face. Samuel squeezed his eyes shut. He had spent years convincing himself he wasn't responsible, that he hadn't let those patients die. But deep down, he had always known the truth. His voice trembled. I left them. The shrieking stopped. The air in the room stilled. Samuel opened his eyes. The figures in the mirror were gone. The dog sat in front of him, watching silently. Its unnatural grin had faded. Then, in a voice that almost sounded human, it whispered, Now you understand. Samuel's vision blurred. The world collapsed around him, and the darkness swallowed him once more. Samuel's eyes snapped open. He was back, lying on the cold floor of the hospital corridor, gasping for breath. His entire body trembled as he pushed himself upright, his mind still reeling from what he had just experienced. Had it been real? A hallucination? A nightmare brought on by exhaustion and guilt? Then he saw it. The dog. It sat just a few feet away, its dark eyes locked onto his. But something was different now. Its grin was gone. The air around it felt heavier, charged with something unnatural. Samuel's chest tightened. The whispering voices were gone, but their presence still clung to him like a shadow. The dog tilted its head. Now you must choose. Samuel's breath hitched. Choose what? The dog blinked slowly, as if the answer was obvious. To stay or to atone. A cold chill crept down his spine. He had seen the truth now. The fire, the deaths, the guilt he had buried so deep he had convinced himself he wasn't to blame. But he was. And now this place, this thing, was giving him a choice. Atonement, or something far worse. A distant sound broke the silence. Footsteps. Samuel turned sharply, his breath catching. The figures were back, charred, blackened silhouettes, stepping out of the walls like shadows peeling themselves from reality. They didn't speak. Didn't whisper. They just stood there watching. Waiting. Samuel's hands curled into fists. He wanted to run, to wake up from this nightmare, but he knew it wasn't that simple. The dog spoke again, its voice softer now, almost sorrowful. They don't want vengeance. Samuel's throat went dry. They want peace. A sickening weight settled in his stomach. All these years, he had been running from the truth. But the past never stays buried. And now, it was demanding justice. Samuel's breath came in ragged gasps as he forced himself to step forward. The figures didn't move, didn't reach for him. They simply waited. He swallowed hard and dropped to his knees. I was wrong. His voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. I should have helped you. I should have done something. The air shifted. The pressure in the room lifted ever so slightly. Samuel's hands trembled as he clenched them into fists against the cold floor. I left you to die, he whispered, his voice breaking. I let you burn. A single tear slipped down his cheek. I'm sorry. The figures moved, not toward him, but upward. Their bodies, once twisted and blackened, began to dissolve into soft, golden light. Their outlines blurred, their suffering finally releasing into the air. And then, one by one, they faded. The corridor grew brighter, the walls no longer burned and broken. The oppressive air lifted, replaced by something lighter, almost peaceful. Samuel felt a wave of exhaustion crash over him. It was done. The past had finally let go. The only thing left now was the dog. Samuel turned toward it, his breath still uneven. What happens now? The creature watched him for a long moment before standing up. You wake up. The world collapsed around him. Darkness swallowed his vision. And then, a sound. The steady beep of a heart monitor. Awakening. Samuel's eyes fluttered open. The real hospital's ceiling stared back at him, bright, sterile, normal. His body ached as if he had been asleep for days. Was it over? He tried to sit up, wincing as pain shot through his limbs. The weight of something warm pressed against his leg. He looked down. The dog sat beside his hospital bed. But this time, it was just a dog. No glowing eyes. No unnatural grin. Just a stray, dirty, but real. Samuel exhaled a shaky breath, reaching out with unsteady fingers. The dog pressed its head into his palm. A sense of peace settled over him. For the first time in years, he felt light. He had been given a second chance. And this time, he wouldn't waste it.